Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Shefali Shah. I work in the Lau China Institute. Welcome to the opening event of our China Week. It's wonderful to see so many of you here this evening. We're delighted that you could make it. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. So just to say, toilets as you exit the room, and to the left, we've got a photographer who will also be taking a few pictures, mainly of the panel, but also the networking. We're also filming the panel discussion, so if you would prefer not to be in it, please do let me know. I'll continue. So we have a fantastic panel of experts joining us this evening, and then there'll be an opportunity for you to ask any questions at the end, and then we'll have a few words from our Vice Chancellor and President Kshitij Kapoor, and a few words from Kerry Brown, who's the director of the Lau China Institute. So without further ado, I will hand over to Fiona Quimbre, who's our chairing tonight's session and panel discussion. Fiona is a senior analyst at RAND Europe, where she also leads their China portfolio.
Thanks, Shefali. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to KCL's China Week. Very delighted to be your host this evening. We'll be diving headfirst into the fascinating world of research engagement with China tonight, unearthing the glittering opportunities as well as the shadowing risks that you may have heard of in the past few months and years. Who benefits from research collaboration with China? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? Are the risks inflated or not? Should UK research collaboration continue in this direction? Should we continue to engage with Chinese counterparts, research partner, alter the nature of our collaboration, or exit the room altogether? How much risk are we willing to swallow? Those are some of the questions that we'll be addressing tonight in our panel. And the timing couldn't be better for this discussion, I really think so. The UK's relation with China is shifting. We are collectively reevaluating the way we collaborate with China. Just this month, Vice Chancellor and senior leaders from over 20 universities in the UK have gone out to China to solidify the UK's position in the country. But some universities have also taken the pulse of newfound risks and put an end to some of their harmful partnership with some Chinese collaborators. At the same time, the government too is thinking about its position on research engagement with China. In its response to the Intelligence and Security Committee Parliament report on China, the government recalled that the Integrated Review Refresh committed to carry out a comprehensive review of the security measures in place within higher education to identify what more government could or should be doing with regards to that matter. So really, tonight's session offers us an opportunity, a very exciting one, to discuss and stimulate thoughtful discussion on direction of the UK's research engagement with China. I'll introduce the panelists, but let's approach this discussion tonight with as much evidence and fact as possible to better equip our policy community with the answers. So without further ado, I'll start off with Michael online. Michael, thanks for joining us. You are currently in Yenching Academy as a Yenching scholar based in Beijing. Michael was previously a policy officer at HEPI, the Higher Education Policy Institute, where he initiated the China program, publishing a collection of essays on UK universities and China, including a very interesting study on the study of China and Mandarin in the UK, and we'll come back to it to talk about China capabilities and China literacy in the UK later on. Then we've got Mark Logan next to me, a Conservative Member of Parliament, MP for Bolton North East. You are the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Ireland and the Irish in Britain, being born in Northern Ireland, and a member of the All-Parliamentary Group on China. And before being elected to Parliament, Mark was a diplomat and worked in the British Consulate General in Shanghai, where he was responsible for media and communication. He also worked for the Chinese conglomerate SunPower. We're also joined by Sophia Gaston, who last week was on Chinese Whisper with the Foreign Secretary. Sophia is head of foreign policy and UK resilience at Policy Exchange, the think tank. She focuses on Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific security theatre. And before joining Policy Exchange, Sophia was director of the British Foreign Policy Group. She's a visiting research fellow at LSE and an academic fellow at the European Policy Centre in Brussels. And then last but certainly not least, Harry Anderson, you're an assistant director of policy and global engagement at Universities UK, the body which represents UK higher education sector and supports university. There, Harry heads up the policy and engagement team and oversees UUKI's work across global research and innovation. And as part of this role, Harry regularly meets with officials, politicians, other senior stakeholders. Prior to that, Harry worked on education, skills policy for a business membership organization. I'll kick off the discussion, hand it to Michael and the rest of the speaker for just a short, brief statement of what they want us to take away from their key argument tonight. Michael, you.
Thanks, Fiona, and hi, everyone. It's just past 1 a.m. in Beijing, so apologies if I stumble over any of my words, but great to be with you tonight. I think looking back over the last few years about how we've sort of reached where we are at the moment, I think it's a story of moving from being in a position where the UK-China research relationship was overwhelmingly and only positive. So looking back 5 years, Viv Stern and David Sweeney at Research England were extolling the UK-China relationship as possibly the first one to have a research and innovation strategy. Everything was very positive. But in the last 5 years, and especially most recently in July with the Intelligence and Security Committee report, the tone has really changed on UK-China research collaboration. And in my view, I think it's probably a good thing. From the evidence which was presented in the report, but I think to some extent the fact that we can have this conversation now and maybe act on this is partially down to some more clarity on what the UK's relationship with China should look like more broadly. And Fiona, you mentioned James cleverly talking with Sophia and Chinese Whispers podcast at the Conservative Party conference, and he mentioned that the government decided not to shut down Confucius Institutes and implied that this was in part due to an implicit trade-off with the functioning of the British Council. And I think this is perhaps one of the first signs we've seen where there actually can be, I guess, there's clarity around the trade-offs which the government want to make around higher education and the China relationship. And I think now is a good time to sort of be having that conversation. Just without spending much more time on reframing, I think, yes, so there's, I sort of feel like there's a,
frame the discussion, Michael. Thanks for introducing the topic and really bringing it to force for everyone. Should we continue? Mark, do you want to continue?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fiona, and everyone at the Lau Institute, and what is probably one of the two best universities around Aldwych. I'm very, very grateful to be here. As an ex-LSE guy, it's fantastic. And I was here 2 years ago, I think, at the inaugural China Week, which is a fantastic week of activities. And I've seen the program this week is even better than it was a couple of years previously. As you rightly pointed out, it was based for a long time, around 13 years, between Shanghai, Beijing, and Nanjing. 我说一些中文吧啊，因为我看有很多中国人今天在这里。就我看 Michael 后面好像是那个波雅塔在那个北大 ，so it brings back memories of studying Chinese in Peking University, and actually thinking back to in the 00s, a time in which we lived where we assumed that globalization was like the air that we breathed, that it was a universal, and that was the path in which we would continue on for forevermore. A bit like academics in the late 80s and early 90s, thinking of Fukuyama on the end of history as one of those other universals which have been questioned increasingly so in recent years. But listen, I'll not talk at great length. I mean, the key point I want to get across tonight as we go into this discussion is that China is a reality of the world in which we live in. It is a reality of the world in the future in which we operate across all the different facets of public life, whether it's in economics, whether it's in politics, diplomacy, commerce, culture, whatever it happens to be, is that increasingly China will be part of potential solutions and may even be, depending on how things happen, adding to problems or lack of solutions. So it's very important that our government, the UK government, gets our relationship correct with China, and I think none more so when it comes to the area of research and higher education, because this is something that the UK does incredibly well compared to our other partners and competitors globally. It's something which China, I think, when they look at the United Kingdom, they see as one of our assets, and why they, currently we have 200,000 roughly Chinese students at different levels throughout our education system in the United Kingdom. I think we should have a lot more, and we'll come on to this later, on capabilities, British students studying in China, or at least learning Mandarin Chinese. So I will end there, but I do think it's an inevitable fact of the world we live in, the world that we will move into, but it's important that, of course, the United Kingdom does continue to diversify under a more international framework.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you so much. I think just to start, we should be very proud that we have been seen as an attractive market destination for Chinese students and researchers, because I think this question is particularly significant here in the UK because our higher education institutions are world-renowned and an enormous part of our global influence, soft power, and also strategic influence. So I think this question is more complex and more weighted than it is in some other countries. But with that said, I don't think there can be any doubt that we have been extremely naive to the risks of research engagement with China. Undoubtedly, there are many fine Chinese scholars who are in pursuit of educational exchange for absolutely the most noble purposes. The problem is that the Chinese state pursues a military fusion hybrid approach to everything, which makes it impossible to really distinguish between military and civil intent, the heart of which is its interpretation of the national interest, which is to override any other kinds of higher-minded objectives. And all citizens are expected to play their role in securing China's economic and technological competitiveness, and those working in areas such as research, which China, like us, like all of our allies, have come to understand is going to be absolutely the vanguard for not only our national security resilience, but our economic prosperity moving forward. These are considered to be on the absolute front lines of this mission. The Chinese state has been very transparent about its efforts to competitively harness the acquisition of external intellectual property, assets, and research expertise for its own objectives. And the obvious conclusion is that these objectives are increasingly misaligned to our own national interest and our interests in the higher international order. The current legislation that's been put in place here in the UK tends to focus on sort of formalized versions of cooperation, but there's still quite a lot of informal engagement that falls outside the scope of this. My sense is that universities are taking quite wildly different approaches to this. In some places, there's been a sort of chilling effect from this new national security legislation, but elsewhere, they are still plodding on. And I don't think that's particularly surprising to have that kind of mixed approach, because I think academia has been given rather a paltry role in geopolitical matters by the government up until now. I do see an argument for engagement in terms of fostering transparency and goodwill. I think it's patently obvious that China's increasing insularity, its decision to expel Western journalists, business leaders, and so on, and restricting formal dialogue settings, that is having a negative consequence for global stability, because, of course, you are increasing the risk of misjudgments and errors on both sides. Just to give us, and this is US figures, but just to give a sense of what that looks like in practice, there's currently around 300,000 students of Chinese origin studying in American universities, compared to just 300 Americans in China. And a decade ago, there were 15,000 American students studying in China. So I think that engagement and visibility and transparency is a good thing and should be pursued. There are certainly likely to be areas in which the risks for research engagement could be assessed to be fairly low. And if these areas of cooperation are able to be leveraged to balance against a much more robust security project in other areas where we assess the risk to be high, then I think that would be a good use of strategic engagement. Of course, we don't want to allow these areas then to foster financial dependencies that will anyway make our universities vulnerable to a further sharpening of the geopolitical environment. But I think what all of this really comes down to is the fact that the university system here in the UK needs to be much more integrated into our national security ecosystem. We are really lagging behind other countries in this respect. I am also at the National Security College in Canberra. This is an academic government institution where civil servants who are in areas that would not necessarily be considered at the heart of national security are still given really high-level national security training. And this is absolutely essential, because they, like us, have come to understand that China is a systemic challenge. That's how it's been described by the government, and that requires a whole of society, whole of government response to build our resilience. So I think, in conclusion, that university needs to be seen as not just delivery partners for our national security, but strategic partners, and that is going to require government working much more closely and collaboratively with the university sector.
Thank you, Sophia. Harry, any response to that?
Plenty, and I'm sure we will come to that in due course. I mean, first of all, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and I think to echo perhaps what we've heard already, I think we really welcome this debate from a university's perspective. So I'm from Universities UK. We represent about 142 universities across the length and breadth of the UK. And I think it's a really important discussion to be having, because I think, to put it bluntly, China's not going to go anywhere, and our universities work extensively with China. And so I think if there's one sort of message that I would like sort of colleagues to sort of take away from my opening comments, it's rather than discussing if we should or shouldn't be engaging with China, it's a discussion about how we should be engaging with China and making sure that we put in place the sort of mitigations and the due diligence, which means that that engagement is safe, secure, and collaborative. And I think you need to sort of really look at the sort of journey that China's been on over recent years in terms of their R&D. If you sort of look back to sort of the early 90s, China was at a similar level in terms of spend on R&D to the Netherlands, whereas actually now, by a lot of metrics, China is one of the leaders in terms of R&D. They have some of the sort of top researchers and academics when it comes to certain specialisms. And so rather than, I think, the narrative often being portrayed as what are the benefits that China gets from collaborating with the UK and what are the risks to the UK in facilitating and working with China, it's actually we need to sort of start recognizing that there is sort of research leaders within China that our universities need and our researchers need to be engaging with, and that's a really important sort of fact that I think we need to sort of bring into the debate a bit more, and I'm sure we'll spend time this evening talking about. And I think, you know, and just to sort of give one perhaps example on that, if you go back to sort of to the year 2000, about 1% of UK research papers had a co-author from China. Jump forward to 2021, that figure was about 11%. So a significant increase. China is a player now in terms of the global R&D space. Now, I wouldn't want for a minute to suggest that any of what I'm saying here suggests that universities are perhaps naive to some of those risks. I think just while sort of China's performance and sort of position as an R&D superpower has changed dramatically over recent years, I think so too has the sector's sort of engagement and awareness of some of the risks and challenges. And I think, you know, we'll probably get onto this, but I think the government has responded to sort of create a different legal and regulatory architecture to sort of make sure that UK security and research is protected. But equally, I think the sector and universities themselves are increasingly taking on that challenge. And I think, you know, there's the HE Export Control Committee, which takes a sort of really proactive role in understanding some of these risks. And I think there's lots of work that we've been doing at Universities UK to try and make sure that, you know, our university members are aware and engaging with those challenges and understand the risks involved. So I think, you know, absolutely there are risks. We wouldn't want for a minute to pretend there isn't. But the fact is that if China is such a sort of superpower in terms of their research and performance, we really need to have a more sophisticated debate around actually how we engage rather than if we should or shouldn't, because there are benefits on both sides to collaboration. And I think good research is always done in collaboration, and so that means we need to be engaging with China too. So I'll perhaps leave it there. But thank you.
Thank you, Harry. So I think Sophia has already made my job a lot easier. She's already, you know, described the wealth of risks we're going to talk about tonight. Risk to research security, risk to economic security and prosperity, to the UK's S&T advantage through, you know, things like IP theft and talent recruitment programs, or risk to freedom of expression. But I really want to come back to Mark and to Harry, because as much as we understand the risk, I don't think we've articulated the benefits and the returns to the UK quite well. And a couple of people in the room might be wondering, you know, why shouldn't we be exiting the room? The risks are very clear. You've acknowledged them. What about the benefits? Could you talk to us very concretely about what are the returns to the UK and why, you know, what the UK has to gain from this research engagement?
So if I just jump in very, very quickly, and I see Kerry sitting in the audience, and I know Kerry's probably published something on this recently. I'm making a political point to begin with, and I will answer concrete benefits of the bilateral relationship in this regard when engaging. And I think that the political point is, I was listening, great interest with Sophia, who is incredibly well thought through on these issues on UK-China over recent years, and it's been very influential in debates within the UK Parliament. And sometimes, I think when I listen to my colleagues on different sides of the House in the UK Parliament, is what I get concerned about politically is that it feels that there's a lack of confidence in what the West and the UK has to offer. Implicit in nearly everything that I've heard over the last 4 years is that the implication, and this hasn't been said explicitly, but the implication is China is doing too well, or China has been too successful, or China's technologies are actually in many areas now already cutting edge compared to most countries and have much to offer in terms of bilateral and multilateral engagement. And it's that crisis of communication sometimes I feel with the liberal order that I get concerned about, because I think our starting point should be that we have still much to offer the world in the UK, European countries, and in the West, but we do have to get our act together again. We can't rest on our laurels of the good field times of the 1990s. And so that's the political point I just like to make, is that by focusing all the time on the threat of China, we're actually failing to see that it's kind of reflecting on our own lack of confidence in what we have to offer. The concrete benefits, I think, when it comes to UK-China, obviously, As I mentioned earlier, there are roughly 200,000 Chinese students at different levels throughout the system within the United Kingdom. Not only is that a financial windfall for UK universities and schools when it comes to tuition fees or helping to pay for research, but it's also the cultural advantage, I believe, that we get from having Chinese students, ethnic Chinese people in our education system. I know UK government has statistics on this, that at primary school, secondary school, university level, the highest achieving ethnic groups in the United Kingdom are Chinese British and Hindu British, I think, followed by Irish. And that's testament to what you'll find across the UK higher education, in that the huge value that Chinese people bring. They bring a lot of hard work when they're coming to study at different levels, and bring some of those insights from their home country on how they've done things in recent years. I think also it's shown when it comes to research, science and innovation, that if you stick to only indigenous research development, that your output will not be as competitive as research that you do cross-border, working with other partners. And before coming into this panel discussion tonight, I did talk with a few contacts at different universities just to make sure that my sort of intuition and gut was correct, and they said that, that was still the case, and that latest research has definitely shown that to be the case. So again, as I said, I think it's that cultural, that economic advantage we get from working with China, but also the research output can be positive also.
Thank you, Harry. Also, could you elaborate also on who benefits from research engagement? Not, the UK collectively. Could we be a bit more precise about that, if possible?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to be less precise to start with, and then come back to being more precise. I mean, I think just building on what we've just been hearing from Mark, I think if you take a really broad perspective here, the idea that sort of we live in an era or an age in which sort of you have a fantastic academic who goes off and does some sort of research by themselves, and sort of then suddenly comes up with a breakthrough in terms of any particular sort of new field or kind of academic area. I think that's probably not how sort of breakthroughs are made, and that actually it does increasingly rely on collaboration. Now, whether that's collaboration within an institution, interdisciplinary research, or whether that's sort of collaboration across different countries, and I think that's why, from our perspective, we were really keen to see secure association to Horizon. But I think that then equally means that engaging with China is really important. And to give a specific example, Tsinghua University is by some measures sort of one of the global leader in 20 different subject areas. And so if we cut ourselves away from sort of research leaders, then we're only harming our own ability to do good research. And I think, again, just to highlight one other sort of specific metric, I think you look at the sort of field-weighted citation impact, which is often how kind of research impact is measured and performance. China has gone from 0.89 in 2016, so not that long ago, to 1.12 in 2020. So that essentially means that their research published in China is 12% above the world average. So they are a global player in this space. So you could look across a whole range of different subject areas, and I think just to highlight a few, climate change, environment, sustainable and renewable technologies, agriculture, food security. There's a whole range of areas where I think we need to be engaging with China because it benefits the research that we do collectively, and ultimately kind of that is good for the rest of society, but also benefits UK too.
Thank you. I think that's quite clear now. We well know the risks and the benefits, and they've been well highlighted. I think the second question that I'm often asked is, do the benefits outweigh the risk? And it really comes down. I know you don't want to answer this question, Harry, but so to you and Sophia, to make it a bit fairer, the question of should we continue to collaborate really hinges on do the benefits outweigh the risk, and for whom again? So, Sophia, Harry, someone want to take a?
I'm sort of happy to go. I mean, so do the benefits outweigh the risks? I mean, again, I think the framing we need to sort of think about is in what areas and sort of how do we mitigate the risks. So due diligence is, without sounding too dry and boring, due diligence is a sort of continual process. And so depending on sort of, it's incumbent on universities and working with sort of stakeholders, not just with China, but lots of other research partnerships too, that they make sure that they kind of do the required due diligence, that they have processes in place to review the partnerships that they're coming to. And so I think it's almost an impossible question to answer in the abstract, but on the whole, for the reasons that I think I've been outlining, I think on the whole, it's not a question about should we, shouldn't we, it's about how we go about that relationship and how we manage it. So I think, yes, of course, we should be continuing to engage, and I think, yes, of course, there are always more that could be done to sort of make sure that those risks are mitigated, but I think the benefits are sort of clear, and as long as we go into this eyes wide open, then those risks should and can be mitigated.
I think it's more ambiguous because I think something that is unclear is whether China has earned the right through its behavior to having demonstrated that it is truly a responsible global citizen, for us to be confident that it would put higher interests above national interests. Because what we have seen is that whenever these come into conflict, it chooses national interest. And what happened at the start of the pandemic is a perfect example of that. I'm not going to comment on the questions of the research being conducted itself, and I think we will never truly know what was going on there. But certainly, the state absconded from its responsibilities as an international citizen, its higher interest to the global community of which it says it wishes to be a part, and it says it wishes to be a respected member of, in seeking to actively suppress information about that and deny that information to the global scientific community. So I think it's very difficult when we have evidence like that to talk in abstract terms about whether or not the benefits can outweigh the risks. I also think, you said earlier, I think we're aware of all the risks. I don't think we're aware of all the risks, and I don't think that information has really seeped in thoroughly enough and widely enough. And this is frankly in part because I don't think government itself has fully got to grips with all the risks. There's so many different areas that are outside of our traditional national security and defense framework, but which are, China will see a strategic intent and a strategic value. And what's happened is for the past 20 years, China has just been very quietly acquiring assets, a great diversity of assets. It has not necessarily always known what it was going to do with these, but it has made an assessment about potential value. Now, not all of these have come through and reaped those dividends, but we've lost a lot of things. We've sold things off cheaply. We've allowed them to be bought out. We can't get those assets back now. Now we're starting to look across this kind of global landscape and the national landscape, and you start to see all these things together forming a bit of a patchwork. It's not necessarily coherent, but they're assets that China has and we do not have. And all of this has meant that we are extremely reactive and on the back foot. And while we are starting to assess risks in various sectors, and I think higher education was a frontier, I think we're getting sort of more integrated into the national security conversation and risk assessment around higher education. But there are so many other areas where there is agricultural, land, and so on, environmental. There is not one aspect of these areas in which China does not make a strategic risk assessment. And until we start to do the same, then I don't think that we can have the confidence to actually be engaging with the sort of open heart, open mind that we would like to. So I think it is possible for us to engage and find those benefits. And I do agree that there is a kind of broader general good of research collaboration. I would just also point out that partly what China has been doing with its increased citations, there is also a strategic element to that. China has focused very much on new frontiers of governance and increasing its citations in this. Russia has done this to some extent as well, less successfully. But in some of these areas like AI and space and so on, China is amassing these citations, and that is used as part of its claim to legitimacy for regulatory standard setting and governance in a regional and even global terms. That is profoundly not in our interest, because we have assessed that China's intent for governance is essentially a dismantling of the liberal, open, stable order that we have helped to create. So I think for all of these reasons, I think we've still got a long way to go before we get to that position where we could be confident enough to engage more openly.
Thank you. And I'll come back to the due diligence later, Harry, because I don't think it's that boring, actually. But maybe that's because I spend my day looking at it. So, Sophia, you said, I don't think we are aware of all the risks. Could you tell us a bit, is there a particular risk that you think we should be paying more attention to? And Mark, as well, is this a result of the fusion doctrine and the cross-government approach to research engagement that, we're dropping the ball, like the intelligence and security report on China said, that we were dropping the ball on security as a result of the whole government approach to research engagement? Could you elaborate on that a bit, please?
Well, we have undertaken in the UK an integrated review of our foreign policy, defense policy, development policy. And the first publication of this was in March 21. There was a refresh that was done, published in March this year, 2 years on, which essentially reaffirmed the structure of the framework, but highlighted some changing circumstances, not least of all, obviously, the appalling Russian invasion of Ukraine. But this framework really was the first time that the UK government said the risks that we face from our strategic rivals, hostile states, however you want to frame them, and the profound challenges being experienced in the stability of the global order require us to take a completely different approach to our foreign policy and national security and resilience, and that is an integrated approach. So that's a whole of government, whole of society. So rather than this being contained in this sort of quite closed-off community, this is something that everybody needs to have a stake in, all the different prongs in that. It's not just about government, it's also about academia, it's about business, it's about citizens themselves. So that's the kind of integrated doctrine. We have had a lot of success and made a lot of progress, I think, in government in actually implementing that, and it is used as a structural framework in a very effective way now. But frankly, I don't think policy making is there yet. We've got the idea and the intent, but we haven't really gone deep enough. So, I think in part, one of the conclusions of making that integrated assumption is that you need a much stronger role in national security for the Cabinet Office, a lot more in oversight and coordination. But I still think that if we're specifically talking about China, there are just too many areas of government where those China capabilities are not there. One thing that came up in that discussion with the Foreign Secretary last week, this China Capabilities Fund, which I hugely applaud that the government has announced, this is meant to be upskilling civil servants' capabilities, that is going to be a competitive bidding process. So different bits of government have to go into a pool and say, we deserve this training on China capabilities more than this other area because we've got these risks. How is that a way to run a country? That's absolutely crazy to me. We need to be increasing them across the board. And, it's not just even about Mandarin speakers and so on. It's really understanding the risks, the strategic risks. And I just think that the number of people in some of these departments, I'm very pro civil servants. I think we've got many outstanding civil servants working really, really, really hard. But that we just don't have a particularly deep, robust understanding of China capabilities in a lot of these other departments that are further away from the center. And so until we can deal with that, I think the sort of integrated doctrine remains a work in progress.
Michael, you've published a really exciting report, and I'll bounce off on just starting to think about the solutions. Sophia started talking about China capabilities. We use different words: China literacy, China competence in the UK. Really increasing awareness really comes down to those words. Could you tell us a bit more about how you think we should go about increasing China capabilities with regards to research engagement? Should this target universities, researchers, the government, any actor really? Or, you know, you've got a really exciting report. I really want to hear more about this if possible.
Yeah, I would agree with Sophia on the slight surprise that it's a bidding process for funding for China capabilities. It definitely seems like it needs to be sort of across the board and more comprehensive. And also agree on the fact that bringing a few people to sort of a middling level of Mandarin won't do very much to help the UK engage better with China. I think the UK National Committee on China published a paper a couple of weeks ago, and there was a point in there around sort of language technology and how, of course, you'll need people who are fluent in Mandarin to engage with China, but sort of mid-level Mandarin isn't going to help. And as Sophia said, sort of a deeper understanding of the dynamics of China and its politics and how it works in the international stage is much more important. I think in terms of how to engage researchers with China competency and maybe more generally building up the UK's ability and stock of China experts, starting with researchers. I think and Fiona, I think you wrote a paper for RAND about on this topic, and one of the recommendations was to give training to researchers around engagement with China. I think I generally think that would be a good thing, but I would just caveat it with from being in a very different role than I am in now, with a consultancy working with lots of universities, just how overwhelmed and how many things how many things academics and researchers have on their plates. I think another sort of day or 2 day training session on eyes wide open research collaboration with China might be effective, but I think we very quickly come into sort of structural problems with how the sector is set up, and that speaks not just to the issue of China competency, but also to due diligence and making good decisions. I think there are incentives in the sector which mean if one university might decide against a research collaboration, but if another university is struggling, and we know that domestic fees have been declining in value, which is part of the reason which is driving more international student recruitment, so in turn they can fund research. I just think maybe some of the solutions lie more in solving some more structural issues in the sector than just the eyes wide open issue. Sorry, could you repeat the second half of your question as well?
How should we raise China capabilities in the UK, and who should it be targeted to?
I think looking longer term, I think one of the critical things and going back to the point on languages is opening up students in primary and secondary schools to China. One of the things which really struck me in the report was that even when China is on the curriculum in key stages 2 and 3, teachers aren't confident to teach about China. So there's sort of a level in which we've got the Mandarin Excellence Program, which is brilliant and is producing more young speakers of Mandarin who hopefully will go on and take the A-level and potentially study it at university, or if not, continue learning it and applying their interest alongside degrees in economics and politics, and that's all brilliant. But there isn't really an effective route for engaging students who might not want to tackle what's probably the hardest language in the world, but actually just engage in what Chinese civilization is. It is a fascinating history, and it should engage people, and that should help more people understand and develop an interest in China. So I think one critical place is in schools. Just as a final point as well, university funding, where the two shiny programs for people interested in China. One is called Schwartzman Scholars, and is based out of Tsinghua and is funded by Steve Schwartzman, an American investment banker. and the other is Yenching, which is funded by a mixture of Chinese government scholarship money and the Chinese donors. And so if the UK isn't building up these opportunities and routes for young people who are interested in China and want to join the civil service or join business and bring that expertise and better equip the UK, then we're hugely under-equipped. Julia Pameli, who was formerly at the China Research Group, made a brilliant point that there aren't lots of internships for young people with China expertise. When she ran the internship program, and there were 2 places, they had upwards of 200 applicants. So I think across the whole pipeline, right from primary education through university and opportunities for people with an interest in China, the infrastructure just isn't there. So a place to start would maybe be expanding the civil service fast stream to include a China track, or including that earlier in the process. But that would be one possibility, but there are many more.
Thanks, Michael. Mark, I know you...
Sorry, can I just...
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Can I just... One more thing, which has just come to me. I think the other point is a huge part of the UK population in the last 2 years. We've had around 200,000 people arrive from Hong Kong on the B&O visa route. These people will be fluent in Cantonese, and many will be speaking Mandarin. They're incredibly well equipped. I think upwards of 70% have a degree or even a master's from Hong Kong. But currently, they're not integrated into the UK system. So this is one thing which universities have been silent on pretty much. B&O holders are being treated as international students, so they have to pay international student fees. And there aren't scholarships which allow them to come into universities. So we're closing the door to a hugely important part of the population, which should be critical in the future of UK-China relations. So I think one thing immediately universities can do and government can do is solve that problem and open up the door for B&O holders to study at UK universities, because at the moment they're being shut out.
Brilliant, thank you, Michael. Mark, I know you also had some views on how to increase China capability in the UK and who it should be targeted to.
I was just thinking, whenever Michael came up with the idea of the China track and the fast stream, I wish that existed when I graduated from university, and I would have got a job much easier back then. It's a great idea, actually, one I haven't heard of before. Sophia's point on not just about Mandarin language, I think it's a very good point. I know a few years ago there were academics in the United States that talked about how you had to have +1. So China would be the +1 to whatever you were studying or whichever profession you went into, and I think that does come round to a whole of society approach to increasing understanding of China, and that it shouldn't just be government directed top down. If anything, as being part of government, a lot of times what we say no one listens anyway, and they prefer a much kind of more grassroots approach to nudging in a certain direction. So I do think that everyone has that obligation to understand why China is relevant to the industry that they're working in or the projects that they're working within, as opposed to just government directives. There is still, though, when it comes to languages, a huge problem. And again, I know Kerry had written about this in years gone past, the low hundreds of people that were studying Chinese at undergraduate level in the UK, and actually speaking with a lot of the directors of East Asian studies at different schools across the UK, oftentimes they found that they were having as much interest for Japanology or for Korean studies, and which is unfortunate in terms of studying Chinese. And I had someone in earlier to Westminster who works within UK-Japan space, and they sort of, made that point that they find that sometimes maybe China from the outside seems too opaque, but I was making the point that that's kind of what attracted me to it, and because of its opacity, because it was more difficult to understand than other countries or cultures.
Maybe a bit of a controversial comment, but on the having a China fast stream track. The French have one. Maybe something for the UK to consider.
We can never take an idea from France. Joking. Of course we could. Yes.
Right.
We spoke of this earlier, and the 3 points that I'm going to make having came from France as a way to conduct arguments.
All right. Let's open up the discussion to the rest of the room. If we're going to take a couple of questions at a time. If you could raise your hand and state your name, affiliation if you feel comfortable with. I'll take 2-3 questions. To say the name of the speaker you'd like to direct the question to, or just open it. This way.
Hi, thank you for this panel. Very interesting things, although I don't quite agree with everything that I heard. Now, I think one of the reasons for this panel is to really translate ideas into recommendations. So let's imagine that we have a broad range of options, policy options. On the one extreme, we have naivety. Like, there is nothing wrong with China, let's continue doing whatever we're doing. On the other extreme, we have anti-China paranoia, very kind of populist paranoia that the current government is, of course, proficient in advocating on so many things. So I'm just wondering, where should we stand exactly? How can we differentiate between academics and universities doing what they are supposed to be doing, and the state coming in and securitizing everything that we write, everything that we say, or everything that we think, perhaps? Okay. So I would like to ask you, where do you draw the line?
Thank you. Second question. This one, and then.
Thanks. So, hi, my name is Glenn Noble. I'm currently a consultant that specializes in research partnerships. And we met previously whilst I was at UK Research and Innovation China office. What I wanted to ask, I guess, was around this notion that Mark's raised about being proactive, and how so much of the interventions recently from government have been very much around defensive and reactive, kind of, new regulations and ways of saying no to things. We haven't had, since the end of the Newton Fund, a sort of proactive, here's what we would like to encourage, here's what we want to do, here's the strategy, here's what we want, here's from government what universities should be doing next. What would that look like as a next step? What do you think should be the things we should be encouraging?
Hi, Mike Page. So I work for the Ministry of Defence, but I'm not asking a question on their behalf. My question is the UK university sector viable without Chinese students and Chinese researchers? And what impact does that have on our policy making? Are we making decisions, policy decisions based on financial reasons, or are we making them based on the benefits or the risks?
So we got a first question on how do we balance government control and academic freedom. Second question on, what would a government proactive agenda on research engagement with China look like? And the last one, the big money question. Any taker? Harry?
Yeah, sure. Perhaps starting with the first question. I think it's a really important point that we perhaps haven't got into through this discussion so far about academic freedom, and actually kind of, universities are sort of autonomous, and it's a sort of a cherished part of, the higher education sector in the UK about academics being free to pursue sort of the truth and sort of the partnerships and the knowledge that they sort of deem is required in order to sort of unlock new discoveries. And I think that sometimes there is perhaps a risk that when sort of talking about UK-China relations, an academic may have actually, there may be an accusation of naivety in terms of an academic having not considered some of the risks, whereas actually it's the academic has considered the risk. They just deem that actually that particular academic, that particular researcher is sort of the leader in their field, and therefore collaboration is required, and there are steps that can be taken in order to mitigate any risk. And again, I think I go back to the point, universities are increasingly investing in due diligence processes and sort of frameworks which look to protect those institutions from some of those risks, and we can talk a bit more about that if necessary. Perhaps just touching on the third question around international students and researchers. I mean, I think there probably isn't a single vice-chancellor in the country that's not thinking about how to diversify international student recruitment. Obviously, you know, I think if you look at the funding of our sector, the income that universities receive from domestic students has been sort of declining as a unit of resource for sort of several years now, close to a decade. Universities undertake world-leading research that is loss-leading. They don't recoup the funds they put into doing world-class research. So international students are the only area in which they can reinvest across the student experience, across research, across their campuses. So I think every Vice-Chancellor will be thinking about diversification. We have done some surveys of our members recently. I think the figure is upwards to 90% of our institutions either are diversifying or have a strategy in place to diversify international student recruitment. Now, that's not to say for a minute, again, that we sort of don't want Chinese students. Chinese students should be made to be welcome. That, you know, we absolutely need to keep the flow both ways going, of UK students going over to China, but Chinese students coming over to the UK. So I think it's a real challenge, but I think every single one of our members is looking at how to make sure that they do diversify, because, you know, again, it goes back to what I was saying right at the start. It's not a matter of how whether we should or shouldn't be engaging with China, whether we should or shouldn't be having Chinese students. It's about actually managing the risk and thinking about how we engage with China.
Thank you. Well, we'll come back to a second question, but just staying on the money issue. I mean, a recent KCL study actually found that despite diversification efforts, there's still a huge reliance on Chinese tuition fees, and India, who's one of the countries towards which universities are diversifying towards, just isn't a foreseeable alternative to China. So, you know, what do you say to that kind of findings from that KCL report?
Sorry, that India
isn't a plausible alternative, and really diversifying away from China is going to be much harder than just saying, you know, let's have more students from India.
Yeah. Oh no, I mean, diversification is easy to say. It's very hard to achieve. I mean, there won't be, you know, there is no kind of like-for-like replacement of China, just like there's no like-for-like replacement of any country. And I think probably what's really important is the government has what they call the International Education Strategy. It's a strategy which is designed to support universities to diversify their intake, but also to increase the numbers of students coming here. And, you know, there's a whole plan in place there. And one of the key elements of that plan, or one of the key enablers of that strategy, has been the introduction of what's known as the graduate visa, or the graduate route, which is essentially a sort of post-study work offer. Now, that is critical to the sector's ability to diversify. It brings us in line with what our international competitors do. So you look at Canada, Australia, China, Canada, Australia, America, other countries provide students with the ability to stay and work after their studies. Now, that has been, if you look at the sort of data, that has really helped unlock diversification and really kind of supported the sector to diversify. I think what's perhaps held back the sector over recent months has been speculation that route will be closed, that actually the narrative that comes out of this country, the rhetoric is perhaps not as welcoming to international students or immigrants generally. And I think although that narrative is sometimes played to a domestic audience, or is intended for a domestic audience, the sector is international, and those stories, they get picked up immediately and spread around the world. And that has a real tangible impact. You can start seeing the impact as soon as statements like that are made. You start seeing members get in touch saying, actually, their students, prospective students, are getting in touch with concerns about what that means for them.
Thank you. So, any taker for the second question, which was, you know, what would a proactive engagement strategy from the government look like? Instead of a responsive one, Sophia, Michael?
Well, I can sort of come in on all three questions because I think they're quite related, actually. What we're grappling with is how we find the right balance between security and openness when we are in an age of strategic competition with a superpower, an authoritarian, totalitarian surveillance state, superpower, which, you know, and I think the fundamental challenge is how we maintain what is good and distinct about liberal democracies and all of the different sectors that thrive within that, outside of government, while also being able to be competitive with a country where there is no such distinction between the market and the state, civilian and military. And that is a really profound challenge. And we're not always going to get it right. But I think the reality is that we are going to, this integrated response, which I think is the correct response, requires all of us to do our part. In some ways, it is a reassertion of the significance and meaning of the nation state. And that means that businesses, for example, are really now on the front line of these geopolitical questions in a way that they weren't before. And the same is true of academia. Now, I would say that the exchange for that is that the state must provide, it must contribute to the resilience of the sector and its capacity to undertake a role within this national security and resilience mission by investing a lot more in all of these different areas which it is deemed to be crucial in terms of outputs. So, you know, and I should say as a side note, because we're very much sort of talking in the sort of STEM space here in science and tech, R&D, I'm a huge believer that government should be funding humanities programs as well, very, very robustly, and they're very, very important as well. But the big defining trend of this decade is the shift towards a national security-led industrial policy. This is something that is being practiced right across the West. The UK is actually singularly uncomfortable with this idea because we have a particular attitude towards various aspects of state intervention. But if you look at what the Biden administration is doing, the EU is doing, you know, this is where we're going. And so I think that there is a logical question about the role of academia within this because of the research commercialization pipeline being so essential within that. All of these critical technologies which we are competing with China on, you know, and we haven't talked about AUKUS yet, but this is one of the most significant national security projects in modern history. And everybody knows about the kind of submarine bit, that Pillar 1. The entirety of Pillar 2 is about advanced technological capabilities. It's the essentially 6 to 8 capabilities that we've said, these are going to be so crucial for our national resilience and our economic prosperity, day-to-day civilian life. And this project is about creating a trilateral domestic market so we can get them to market 10 times faster than we would have otherwise. That's what competition with China looks like in meaningful terms. Because if you look through ASPI in Australia, did a really fascinating report, and they've got this ongoing technology competitiveness tracker. I would highly recommend looking it up. And it's a good news story for Britain. Because what you will see again and again is in many of these core tech capabilities, the UK is often number 2 or number 3, number 5. You know, we are genuinely competitive in some of these things. And the US and China are usually kind of fighting it out for 1 or 2. A project like AUKUS is how you kind of compete. But AUKUS is not just going to be delivered by big defense primes. Academia will play a really, really crucial role in that. So my feeling is that we are going to have some uncomfortable moments in this process of moving to respond to the realities of the international order. What we had before is gone. We are trying to uphold an international order that has vastly served our interests, and we're going to have to shift to a completely different mindset in universities, in business, citizens, and so on. It is government's responsibility to take all of those sectors there and involve them in the conversation. So I think that's really important. And just quickly on this question about financial viability, because this is part of it, and I do think the government is going to have to take a bigger role in funding the sector, and that's the inevitable conclusion of all of this. But when Australia was in a trade war with China very recently, there were frantic conversations going on in Australia's higher education system, because if you think we have a reliance on Chinese students, Australia at that time, I mean, it was extraordinary. And again, that's a good news story for Australia. It's a reflection of how high quality its education system is seen to be. But it was hugely vulnerable in that moment. And so that's not a faraway fantasy reality. These are serious policy questions that we have to deal with. And one of the most profound consequences of Russia's invasion of Ukraine was businesses looking at that and the extraordinarily effective sanctions regime that was applied by G7 towards Russia as a result of that. And they started proactively pulling out of Beijing as a result. Russia invaded Ukraine, but they're pulling out of Beijing because they're looking at that, and they're looking ahead to 5 years, 10 years, where you're having to businesses need certainty and forecasting certainty. And they're taking decisions, So I think we have to be real. This is the geopolitical reality. So how is it acceptable to have a situation where a quarter of international student fees are coming from a country that we have designated to be an epoch-defining challenge and a systemic threat?
Thank you. 10 minutes before the end of the panel. Any last questions from the audience? Got one here, perhaps the last one. Two here.
Fiona, can I just add something to what Harry said?
Let's just take this question, and then we'll come back to you, Michael, and you can also build on the questions from the audience.
Super quick one. I'll sit down. I guess we spoke a lot about how we can learn more and understand China in the UK. What is the panel's opinion on using China's neighbours, whether it's in Southeast Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia? They've lived with China for centuries. How do they view China in different ways? What can we learn from them? Are we engaging with them to find our way of approaching China, especially as we're seeing it more, or the UK and most of the West is seeing it as more of a risk?
The lady in front.
Hi, I'm Alexis Brown, British Council. Sophia, you mentioned this idea of universities increasingly becoming foreign policy actors, and that maybe being a role that they're not so comfortable with or not used to. And I wondered if you could say more about what that means to you, but the panelists as well. Is that something that you agree with, and what does that look like for you?
Thank you. So we'll let Michael jump in first, and then Mark and Sophia will answer the questions. Are you on mute, Michael? Okay. Had to do it once.
Yeah, I have to do it once. Just on a small point on, to build on Harry's point around increased mitigation and investing in due diligence. I guess I'd just love to see more evidence of this and more communication of this to the wider sector. And just this is anecdotal, but I think it comes back to the China competence issue as well. And this was highlighted in the ISC report around there being examples of Chinese researchers changing their institutional names and lying about their backgrounds in defense organizations. And if there isn't China competence in-house or enough, and what I mean by that is people who can follow the thread in Mandarin language and translate that, then you've got to question how far, how effective the due diligence can really be. And just one final thing to add. I know there are one or two institutions who are outsourcing their some research due diligence to China expert organizations, but those organizations are few and far between generally in the UK, although there have been lots popping up. And I just wonder how far that due diligence really is effective, and I think it would be helpful to see more evidence of what that actually looks like in practice. That was what I wanted to add.
So I think just going off the last question first on that idea of those in universities being foreign policy actors, I think we have to be incredibly careful because obviously that's not primarily, if you're an academic, your job. But at the same time, I think listening this evening, and I think over the last kind of few years in the political debate on China within the UK, it's something I'm always asking myself when I'm listening to someone else at the talk is China becoming more like the West, or is the West becoming more like China? You know, are we introducing more policies to national security legislation and protecting our industries and having this whole of state approach and having state intervention and the state has to do this? And because to me that sounds like China. That sounds like the China I lived in and worked in and operated in, is one that saw the power of the state to help deliver things. And as Sophia rightly pointed out earlier, it's something that within the United Kingdom, more so than many European countries, even, I mean, it's actually incredible under the United States and the Biden administration, that is going for an increasing, through the IRA and the whole of state approach, that to me, I would ask that, I think the underpinning question is the West increasingly learning from China? That's the question I have, to be provocative. And I hear it every day in, day out. Every time I hear a new policy idea, or China has BRI, and we then we say we have this new investment regime where we can attract countries, and I think like it's kind of China setting the agenda, and then we're following in the footsteps. The other one on, I thought it was a great question as well, but behind you just on learning from East and Southeast Asia, I think absolutely, and I think that's what the integrated review and the tilt for the United Kingdom towards the Indo-Pacific is all about. It's partly about is realizing that, you know, Asia isn't just China, although it's a major part of the Asia-Pacific, but we have a burgeoning relationship with Japan, a market of 120, 130 million people. And in Southeast Asia and ASEAN countries, there's a huge amount of opportunity, and I know our minister, a plug for the minister, Nigel Huddleston, who's done a lot of work on the free trade agreements and other work with trading in those countries, and our trade commissioner. So I do think there is a lot to learn by expanding there. I mean, to your specific point on, I suppose, understanding China through its neighboring countries, I think yes, to an extent, but I think the Chinese and China would probably argue in much the same way as America has over the last 100 years, that there's a certain amount of exceptionalism, and it probably requires working within that culture and within that country to really scratch beneath the surface and not just observing it from the outside.
Thank you. And perhaps last words to Sophia. I mean, the fifth question was for you, university becoming foreign policy actor. But I'll inject one last question is, we've focused on protect, engage. We've kind of forgotten about align in our discussion, you know, the third buzzword in the UK's policy approach towards China. So do you also have any final comments on, you know, how could the UK's policy towards research engagement with China align with core allies and partners?
I mean, look, I completely agree. The last thing we want is, in pursuing a national security-led industrial policy and a much more kind of whole-of-society approach to resilience, is to actually lose the parts of our society and our democracy and the structure of our economy and so on that positively distinguish ourselves from China. And look, I don't believe we're at any risk of that happening in any time soon. You know, I mean, you just in very rudimentary terms, I mean, public debate, freedom of ideas and expression and so on. We're just in a completely different stratosphere. And I think we have to constantly remind ourselves of the significance of the innovation environment that comes in open societies. And, you know, obviously there's going to have to be sense checking along the way. But I think this is the consequence of competition. We have to be, in some degree, on a kind of wartime footing, because what we are defending here is kind of existential to us. A multipolar world is in no way in our interest, and we've sort of made those conclusions along with our allies. There is an enormous amount of coordination that goes on behind the scenes, particularly within the G7 and increasingly G7+3 allies on these kinds of policies. I would say the flip side from us taking a much more security conscious approach to things like research collaboration with China is that we are also, through projects like AUKUS, some of the extraordinary new agreements that we've been signing with Japan and so on, we are also moving into a much more positive, deeper collaboration environment with other allies, and also bringing in new kind of partners that we hadn't been working with as much, including some partners from the Indo-Pacific. So I think there are positive dividends, and we need to balance that security environment with being much more open to others as well. But I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that this framework of strategic competition is going to define this century, and it's a battle we can't afford to lose.
Thank you. Kerry, I think you may be inviting us for drinks later. No. Well, while you make your way to the podium, I'll just say thank you. Thank you, Michael, for staying online this late. Have a good night in Wudao, because I'm sure that's where you're heading now. And thank you for everyone else for joining, and happy China Week.